Folks from across the country who's live stream with us, who are joining us, so certainly welcome all. Pastor Roy did a wonderful job suggesting this and getting this in place. Maybe the only thing I would do before he does the introduction is just ask anyone in the room who has worked or works at NIH just to raise your hand so Dr. Collins has a sense of who's there. All right, anyone ever know someone who works at NIH? Raise your hand. All right, Pastor Roy.
Thank you all for being here. It's a wonderful occasion. I'm going to go straight to the introduction of Dr. Collins. And Dr. Francis Collins is a committed Christian whose witness is essential to his life and his scientific work. He's also a physician and a geneticist. Some of you will know that his groundbreaking work led to the discovery of cystic fibrosis, among other diseases. In 1993, he was appointed the director of the International Human Genome Project, which successfully sequenced all 3 billion letters of our DNA. Wow, that's enough for a lifetime, right? But as the ad says, there's more. He also served 3 presidents as director of the National Institutes of Health before retiring in 2025. Dr. Collins founded the BioLogos Foundation that encourages faith and science working hand in hand. It's a bit of a think tank for scientists and researchers that also share in common the Christian faith. BioLogos explores God's Word and God's world to inspire authentic faith for today, and he remains currently a senior fellow. He's the author of The Language of God in Belief, which many of you have pointed out to me that you've read, which explores his own journey from an atheist to finding meaning in the Christian faith. His current book, The Road to Wisdom, offers a path to wisdom and encourages us to build bridges of trust, to seek wisdom and to practice a generosity of spirit. And very soon you'll discover that he enjoys playing the guitar. And he brought his guitar. That's amazing. If you look at it, maybe he'll talk about it. So I invite you to please welcome our brother, Dr. Francis Collins.
Thank you, Pastor Roy. Good morning, Good Shepherd Lutheran. I'm honored to be here with you this morning to worship with you in a wonderful service that I had the chance to be part of. And now to say a few words about this issue about science and faith and how, in my view, these are not in conflict, but they're actually remarkably harmonious and complementary. And at this moment where we seem to be at a difficult juncture in our country with a lot of divisiveness and polarization, I'm concerned that sometimes that seems to have reactivated some of the distrust of science, which over the course of centuries has oftentimes afflicted people of faith, and which in this current circumstance I think is particularly unfortunate. So I may say something about that as well. I thought it'd be good, though, to start off with a prayer, and I'm particularly fond these days of a prayer that I got from St. Augustine, somebody whose work many years ago, 1,600 years ago, in ways that are really quite stunning, presaged many of the things that we are dealing with and debating here in 2025. So this is a prayer of someone who's not having a great day. That's how this prayer was clearly written. And I think we've all had some of those lately. I've certainly had that experience. So pray with me if you would. God of our life, there are days when the burdens we carry chafe our shoulders and weigh us down. When the road seems dreary and endless, the skies gray and threatening, when our lives have no music in them, and our hearts are lonely, and our souls have lost their courage. Flood the path with light. Run our eyes to where the skies are full of promise. Tune our hearts to brave music. Give us the sense of comradeship with heroes and saints of every age, and so quicken our spirits that we may be able to encourage the souls of all who journey with us on this road of life to your honor and glory. Amen. I thought I might start with a little bit of my own history because people are often curious about how this guy who's devoted his professional life to the study of science and medicine, and particularly the study of DNA, the molecule of life, is also a Bible-believing Christian. Many people assume, well, that must be because that's how you were raised, and you learned those particular spiritual truths and worldviews as a child, anchored yourself in that foundation, and it remained for the rest of your life. And that would be a great story, but that's not my story. I was raised on a small farm about 3 hours from here. Pastor Roy Howard knows that area well, having come from that area of the Shenandoah Valley himself, and we've been friends a long time. My parents were doing the 60s thing, except it wasn't the 60s yet. My father was a folk song collector, a drama professor, and a fiddle player. My mother was a playwright and somebody who had great love of language. I did not go to any school until the 6th grade because my parents felt they were better teachers than what was available in Augusta County, Virginia. And I think they were probably right. No bad news about Augusta County, Virginia, but a lot of good news about my parents. But my teaching as a child was about learning the joy of discovering new things in mathematics and history and literature and languages. Religion or faith traditions were not included in the curriculum because those were not of much interest to my mother and father at that point in their lives. Ultimately, we moved in town. My grandmother had a stroke. This is in Stanton, Virginia. And I had the good fortune then to be enrolled in a very good public school, and that's where I got excited about science in a 10th grade chemistry class taught by a remarkably gifted teacher who helped me understand that science is really a detective story. There's truth out there waiting to be discovered about how nature works. And if you have the right tools and the determination and the willingness to accept failure, because that's part of it, you can discover stuff that nobody knew before. Why wouldn't you want to spend your life on that? Well, I decided I did. So I went off to the University of Virginia. There in the dorms, during those late night discussions with other people, occasionally the topic of faith would come up. And there would be furious debates between the people who were deeply committed Christians, people of other faiths, and people who were actually pretty aggressive atheists. And I listened to all this without any real foundation to rest upon. And I kind of decided this didn't make a lot of sense to me, and maybe the atheists had the better hand of it. And maybe that was the answer I'd kind of prefer, because I really didn't want to think about having to be accountable to anybody. Heck, I was 16 and 17. I went to college early. The idea of being unaccountable was pretty appealing. So I majored in chemistry. I went on to get a PhD in chemistry at Yale. And in the process of that, began to realize I'd narrowed my horizons prematurely and kind of ignored life science because it was messy compared to, say, physics and chemistry. And let's be clear, it is messy, but it's gloriously messy. And I realized that the most important chemical that I could ever imagine studying is this one called DNA, that remarkable polymer that carries information, that is the information molecule, the instruction book of all living things. And we're beginning to unravel its mysteries, and I think I want to be part of that. Not knowing quite what to do, because this was quite a strong turn in direction, I decided the best way to keep all of my options open, and maybe you might say avoid ever having to get a real job, was to go to medical school. So despite already being married with a small child, I went off to the University of North Carolina to learn medicine. And it was just what I had hoped. This remarkable moment of seeing this is science, but it's science of the human body. It's going to have real significance for helping people with terrible diseases. And the most important part of it for me was this molecule DNA, and somehow that's all going to fit together. Although at the time I was first getting into that space, most people thought that would not happen in our lifetime. The study of genetics might be interesting somewhere in a laboratory, but it probably wouldn't make any difference in the clinic or the hospital. That's all changed, as you know. But I was still an atheist. And occasionally colleagues, medical student colleagues, would ask to have a conversation with me about faith, and I would avoid that because I knew it was going to make me uncomfortable. But then in the third year of your medical school experience, you're pretty much done with your coursework, and you're out there in the hospital taking care of patients, many of whom have really terrible diseases that we are not going to be able to cure, doing what you could to try to provide some reassurance, some therapy that might potentially buy a little more time or relieve a little more suffering, but recognizing the imperfections of our art. And as I watched these good North Carolina people struggling, many of them with illnesses that were clearly terminal, I had to wonder how I would handle that. It made me very uncomfortable. I had a patient, an elderly woman, who reminded me a lot of my grandmother, who had very severe heart disease and would have these episodes of chest pain that were really quite horrendous, almost a daily basis. But she had a very strong faith in Jesus. And while our medical help wasn't providing her much benefit, her faith clearly was. And she was very open sharing that with me. And one particular afternoon, after one of those episodes, I was in her room, and she once again told me that she got through all of this because she knew that Jesus right there beside her, and that was all she needed. And she sort of stopped in the middle of the paragraph and said, "You know, Doctor, I've shared my faith with you a few times now, and you never say anything. What do you believe, Doctor?" Think about that. 4 words. What do you believe? Do all of you know how you would answer? I bet some of you do, and maybe some of you aren't quite sure. Well, I sure wasn't sure. I felt the color rise in my face, this sense that I was standing on ice that was cracking under my feet. I stammered something like, "I don't really know." Saw her stunned look of surprise and got out of the room as fast as I could. But it really stuck with me, this moment. It sticks with me today. I can see the room. I can see where she was in the bed. I know where I was. And I felt, I need to do something about this. I've probably been asked the most important question I've ever been asked, and I've spent 0 time working on an answer. I think atheism is still true, but I need to be better prepared to defend it than I just was. So I better do some work here. And that began a 2-year journey for me, trying to understand, why do believers believe? And why do atheists not believe? And what's the actual evidence behind one of those conclusions, if there is any? Or is this all just one of those emotional things that you either have the urge to believe or you don't? And at that point, I sort of didn't want to. I was practicing willful blindness to most of the evidence, and maybe it was time to open my eyes. So through the counsel of a lot of good people who listened to blasphemous questions, particularly a pastor who lived down the street and who handed me a book and said, "Maybe you ought to have a look at this because it might touch some of the areas that you're wrestling with." And the book, as you might have guessed already, was C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity. And reading the very first chapter of that book, entitled Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe, I realized that my atheist arguments were those of a schoolboy, that they had no depth to them at all. Then I began to realize that maybe science, which I had very much trusted, I was a believer in science, provided me with some evidence that I had ignored. because it may be uncomfortable, but now it's time to think about it. Science is a great way of examining how nature works, but why does nature work the way that it does? Why is there something instead of nothing? Science can't answer that question. Why did the universe have a beginning? And how could that have happened out of nothingness? Nature is not known for creating suddenly, in a flash, an entire universe in a way that science can't really understand or look back to that very first moment. Why does the universe follow certain laws that govern matter and energy? Gravity, for instance, or the way in which light travels, or the strong and weak nuclear forces, or the way that electromagnetism follows an elegant, beautiful set of Maxwell's equations. And those mathematical descriptions are beautiful to a mathematician, and I sort of thought of myself a little bit in that regard. Why should that be? Why should the universe have this kind of rationality, this logic? It cries out for the idea there's a mind behind all of this. And even more stunning, something that I did not really know until I read a little further, and it's only recently been realized in the last 4 or 5 decades, that the universe is fine-tuned to make it possible for something interesting to happen. Let me explain. Those equations that describe how matter and energy behave, they have constants in them: the speed of light, the gravitational constant. You can't derive the value of those constants from theory. You have to measure them. You have to do the experiment. And so people began to wonder, well, what kind of universe would it be if they were a little different than what they are? Take gravity, for instance. Suppose gravity was just a tiny bit stronger. Some days it feels like that, but believe me, it's constant. And it turns out it doesn't work anymore, because if gravity was even about 1 part in a billion stronger than it is, then the Big Bang, where everything started flying apart at the beginning of the universe, would certainly result in some coalescence of particles and ultimately stars, but they would come back together a little too soon. And by now we would have had a big crunch, and there would be none of us, or any possibility of us. And if gravity was just a tiny bit weaker, then those particles that started flying apart 13.5 billion years ago would just continue flying apart. There would be not enough gravity to actually coalesce into stars and planets and us. It would be the most incredibly boring, sterile kind of universe. So how can that be that gravity has to have exactly the value that it does, precisely what it is? If you go a billionth one way or the other, it doesn't work anymore. And that's not the only one. All of these other constants that we have measured turn out to have that same sensitivity. That is stunning. So if you think there's a mind behind this, it's also a mind that seemed to be interested in a universe that would have some complexity, something about it that would make it even possible for creatures like us to appear. The only alternative I see to saying there's a mind is the alternative that some put forward when they're a bit flummoxed by all this, which is there must be an infinite number of parallel universes. And those infinite universes have different values of these constants. And of course, we're here, so we got lucky. We're in the one where everything worked. We will never be able, as far as anybody can tell, to actually measure the existence of those other universes. So which of these requires greater faith? To believe there is a mind, namely God, the Creator, that made this all possible, including this precisely tuned universe, or that there are all these other universes that we'll never be able to measure, but you need to believe in those. Pretty compelling. It seemed to me that the first alternative, if you want to use Occam's razor, which is the famous logical argument, points you in the direction of this. And Einstein got there too. And so did even Stephen Hawking. But that doesn't get us to a God that cares about you and me. So the rest of my 2 years was trying to figure out, okay, I think I got to deism. Can I actually get to theism? the idea that God has an interest in humanity, it comes back to that first chapter of Mere Christianity, the moral law. There are various pointers to God. None of them are proof, but I think this is a really strong one. There is such a thing as good and evil. Every human society that we know about has agreed to that. It feels like that is a law. It's a law that we break all the time, but we know when we break it, and then we make excuses, don't we? When you do something you know wasn't quite right, you don't say, the heck with your moral law. You say, well, I was tired, or they were mean to me, or there's some other explanation for why I decided to do that thing that wasn't quite right. And even children appeal to the moral law. At a birthday party, maybe out here in the lobby, her piece of cake was bigger than mine. Why do you think there's a law of fairness anywhere? Where does that come from? That's not just cultural. That seems to be wired into all of us. What's cultural is what we decide fits in the good column and what fits in the evil column. We're very influenced that way. But nobody says there's no such thing. Now, why should that matter? If I was looking for evidence of a God who cared about us, and I found in my heart this kind of a signpost, a calling to be holy, that feels like a pretty important moment of realization, both that God does care about me and also that God is holy. But then I ran into a dilemma. If God is holy, and God is caring about me and asking for me to also follow that lead and be holy as well, I know I'm failing. I'm failing a lot. And just as my sense of God's existence was beginning to emerge, I felt this deep sense of alarm that the only way God could probably view me would be as a judge because of all the things I know I'm doing that are against God's law. And into that gloomy space came the person of Jesus Christ, who I had thought was a myth. I didn't know that Jesus, as a historical figure, is better documented than Julius Caesar and a whole lot of other people. Nor did I realize what it meant to say, those words that I had heard people say and just dismissed as gibberish, that Jesus died on the cross for me so that I could have access to a holy God, despite all of my sins and imperfections, that I was washed in the blood. Those remarkable phrases suddenly had the greatest truth of anything I could imagine. And I was basically there 2 years into this. Was there a moment? Yes, there was. I was on a hike in the Cascade Mountains in the northwest of our amazing country. I'd never been there before. It was a beautiful fall day, kind of late in the fall, so it was already pretty chilly. And as I turned a corner, there in front of me was a cliff. And on that cliff was a frozen waterfall that had trickled down from above with the sun glinting off of it, this beautiful crystalline picture. And something just happened. I felt God's presence right there at that moment, and I no longer could resist. Did I do so with a sense of relief? Yes. With a sense of, I know this is right? Well, I hope so. It was like that moment where you can no longer say no, even though part of you is still unsure. And I got on my knees and I said, Jesus, I want you to be my Savior. I want you to be the one who guides my life. I'm through with resisting. I was 27. So that was 48 years ago. And that has stuck with me for those 48 years through a lot of trials and difficulties over time, a broken marriage, a daughter who was subjected to horrendous violence. And yet God has been there all the time. Not that I've not had doubts. I think Paul Tillich was right when he wrote that doubt is not the opposite of faith. It's an element of faith. When you have a doubt, look at it. Study it. Try to interpret what exactly it's teaching you about some part of your faith that needs some work. At least that's the way it's been for me. And those times of doubt have often ended up yielding a stronger, more mature faith that is less tripped up by a question that I had avoided thinking about. Now, of course, when I told my friends in medical school and then in residency and then as a fellow in medical genetics that I was a Christian, they predicted this would not last long. Said, you are going to have the most amazing conflict of worldviews and your brain is going to explode. Because doesn't everybody know that you can't put both of these things together? And you know what? It never happened. I think I was fortunate to come to faith in my 20s and not to have already burned into my brain certain interpretations of origins of the universe and origins of humanity that in many ways are now considered to be the only way to read the Bible, particularly Genesis. Going back to Augustine that we started with, you know, Augustine wrote several books about Genesis. He was sort of obsessed about it, and he very appropriately warned Christians going forward, let no one put forward that they have the precise answer about how to interpret those 6 days of creation, because there is no particular reason that any one of those interpretations should be considered closer to the truth than the others. Perhaps there's some mystery intended here. And yet, particularly in America in the last 150 years, there's been a great emphasis on a literal interpretation of Genesis 1, which has caused, I think, a lot of people trouble in terms of accepting what science is teaching us. And what is science teaching us? That the universe is 13.5 billion years old, that this earth that we are fortunate to walk around on but need to take care of is more than 4 billion years old, and that we humans are part of an amazing tapestry of evolutionary connections with other species, but we are in a very special category of being filled with the Holy Spirit and to have God as our creator in a way that we have learned how to love and how to appreciate the grace that is granted to us. I started this foundation called BioLogos, which Pastor Roy mentioned, to try to help with that. If you don't know about that, it's easy to find on the internet, BioLogos, BIOLOGOS.org. Millions of Christians who are interested in science go there on a regular basis to engage in civil discourse about how science and faith are in fact complementary and teach something to each other. The book I wrote, The Language of God, goes into more details about that if you're interested. But let me reassure you that for many of us who are serious scientists, but also serious Christians, the way to put this together is available. And it's actually remarkable and joyful. It is not a reason for people to feel like they've got to abandon either science or faith. And yet that still seems to happen. I'm glad there are a lot of young people here. I get an email probably every week or so from a young person who was raised in a church where it has to be accepted that the earth is young, and it has to be accepted that evolution is evil in order to be a good Christian. And they end up in a university and see the evidence that supports scientifically what we really know about ourselves and about the nature of creation. And they are in total crisis, feeling like maybe I've been told things at church that weren't true, so why should I believe any of it? Or maybe science really is an evil endeavor that I need to walk away from and never look at again, even though I kind of thought I was interested. Those are terrible tragedies. We should not be putting people in that situation. And I think, again, we're making progress there with BioLogos and other efforts. I think there is less of that tension in terms of origins than there was 20 years ago. As you heard, I've had this remarkable privilege of being given the chance to serve in various ways in science leadership, the Human Genome Project, this remarkable effort of 2,400 scientists in 6 countries working together to read out that first copy of the Human DNA Instruction Book. Just an amazing adventure and a historic one. I do think historians looking back on this period a few hundred years from now will point to a few things like splitting the atom and going to the moon and sequencing the human genome as having been really remarkable landmarks in our species' effort to try to understand what's around us and what we can do about it. And in this one in particular, how we can help our own opportunities to stay healthy or to treat illness. And then I was asked to serve as the NIH director, overseeing the world's largest supporter of biomedical research for 12 years, serving three very different presidents, but in a circumstance where for most of the time, medical science was one of those areas that was not partisan. Everybody cared about seeing answers to cancer and diabetes and heart disease and rare diseases and doing new basic science discoveries that might yield something surprising and a breakthrough. It was not hard to make that case when I was on Capitol Hill, which I was usually once or twice a week, presenting what's happening scientifically to people from both parties, both houses, and the administration. It was one of those wonderful oases where people could agree. And then COVID came along. 2020 was the year with no sleep for me and for the hundreds of other people who gang together from NIH, from academics, from FDA, and from industry to try to do everything we could to speed up the development of therapeutics and especially vaccines. And that was a remarkable moment, seeing the willingness of everybody to roll up their sleeves, not worry about who's going to get the credit. Operation Warp Speed, which was put together very quickly at that point, doing some pretty dramatic things to try to speed up the timetable of vaccine development, which normally takes about 5 or 10 years, and resulting in a vaccine which in those phase 3 trials, very rigorously done, and with the unblinding revealed of the results in late November of 2020, showed that the vaccine was 95% effective in preventing hospitalization and death, and had a very limited indication of serious side effects. That was so much better than any of us had dared to hope for. I had prayed really hard all through that year about this outcome and almost dared not to hope for something this good, and there it was. And so I think a lot of us probably felt by the end of 2020 that we are maybe seeing the light at the end of this dark tunnel. And as the vaccines rolled out and people rolled up their sleeves and you could see the national optimism beginning to return, but then it didn't quite happen for a lot of our country. By June of 21, 50 million Americans had decided, no, that vaccine is not for me. Good, honorable people, but beset with all kinds of information coming from all sorts of sources, questioning whether the vaccine was safe, whether it worked, whether it was actually evil. Preachers in some churches saying this might be the mark of the beast, getting that vaccine, and other crazy things like Bill Gates has put a chip in that syringe so that he can track you, or it's going to cause infertility, or all manner of other ideas. And as one of those, at that point, head of NIH, shoved in front of cameras a lot, saying, tell the people what's happening here, I don't think we were as effective as we should have been in actually getting the message across to skeptics about what the data really showed. And so over the course of the next 9 months, from June of 21 until March of 22, as the COVID pandemic was raging, 234,000 Americans died who shouldn't have. That's the number. 234,000 in graveyards. It's like 3 jumbo jets crashing every day for 9 months. Because of misinformation, disinformation, distrust, because our culture wars were killing people. And maybe hardest of all for me to see in the midst of this terrible story, I had thought people of faith would be in the best position to be able to sort through lies and truth and be a source of truth to their neighbors. The group that was most likely to reject the opportunity of a life-saving vaccine. We're white evangelical Christians. I still use that word evangelical, although it's become very politicized. But the original meaning, somebody who's really serious about their faith and wants to share that good news with other people, yeah, that's me. But my white evangelical colleagues were the most likely to be skeptic and to say no. So the vaccine did save, we think, about 3.2 million Americans. You might be one of them. We don't know who we saved. We know who got vaccinated and who's here. And 3.2 million people are in that category. But there was still this terrible tragedy. So after this experience and having 12 years in this role, it was time for me to step down and let somebody else take on the reins. But I was so troubled about it that I felt I had to do something, I had to say something about what's happened to our society, both to people of faith and to people of no faith. What's the basis upon which we have become so divided, so polarized, so unable to talk with each other about some topics because we know it's not going to go well? We've lost our ability in many ways to listen, as well as to listen well enough to be able to say to somebody, here's what I heard you say. We need marriage counseling as a country. So I felt maybe there's something I can do in this regard, and although I am not somebody who picks up the idea of writing a book and thinks, oh goody, it's more like, I guess I have to do this. I was greatly benefited by being able to spend a lot of time about then with my spiritual mentor, the Reverend Tim Keller, pastor of Redeemer Church in New York, somebody who'd been a wonderful colleague talking about science and faith issues, but now Tim had pancreatic cancer. And Tim was at NIH, enrolled in a very bold immunotherapy protocol for his pancreatic cancer, one that involved things that had never quite been done before for this particular condition, which at times made him very sick, but at one point had this rather miraculous outcome, unfortunately short-lived. But Tim had an extra year of life that he never would have had it not been for this approach. He did not want to talk about cancer when I spent time with him. He wanted to talk about Jesus. And he wanted to talk about our society and what the church needs to do. And he was relentless in saying, Francis, you have to write this book. So if you read the book and you hate it, blame Tim Keller. So the book is called The Road to Wisdom. What is wisdom anyway? I have to sort of think about that. I'm a scientist, so I'm all about facts and evidence and knowledge. And you need that for wisdom, but it's not enough. Wisdom has to add to knowledge other important things like judgment, like experience, like morality. Knowledge doesn't necessarily have moral character, but wisdom needs to. I'm fond of the story about how one gets wisdom, which is probably apocryphal, but maybe it makes the point. There's a young man who wants to know the source of wisdom, and so he goes around asking all the people that he thinks would be smart about this, and they're all a little vague about where you get this. But they said, there is that guru up in the mountains, so climb up there and find him, and he can probably answer your question. So he climbs up into the mountains, looks around, finally finds the guy. Said, oh, Master, I'm so glad I found you. I am here for you to tell me, what is the source of wisdom? How do I get this? And the Master says, oh, well, that's quite simple. Good judgment. Well, that sort of made sense, but it was a little unsatisfying. So he said, wait a minute. Okay, but how do I get good judgment? Also simple. Experience. Well, I'm just a young guy. How do I get experience? Bad judgment. It's true, isn't it? The times where I think I have learned something that maybe I carry with me, and it would even deign to say that was now an acquisition of a little bit of wisdom, oftentimes follow bad judgment. The first part of this book tells you my very first experiment in molecular biology, which was a complete and utter failure because I didn't use very good judgment in designing the experiment. And so This ends up after 6 months with me crying in the men's room, trying to figure out, what can I learn from this? Bad judgment. Next time, design the experiment, fully understanding what you're doing, and you'll have a better chance of actually discovering something. So yeah, we need wisdom. Again, if you want to think about the difference between wisdom and knowledge, think about knowledge as Spock and wisdom as Yoda. That's the sense. We don't have enough wisdom at the moment, and our knowledge seems to be really contaminated by a disagreement about what it means to say something is true. This is a deep concern. So the whole chapter here about truth. There may be people who really think there is no such thing as objective truth. I think that's mostly happening in freshman philosophy courses as a means of just kicking around the idea. But for this group here, let's accept there is such a thing as objective truth, okay? The earth goes around the sun, not the other way around. There is a flat earth society. Thousands of people belong to it. I hope none of you. The earth is not flat. Let's get past that. So there's this whole body of information from science, from history, that we could say is established facts. And if somebody's going to grab something in that category and say, well, it's not true for me anymore, they better have a really strong reason to make that argument. Otherwise, we should say, no, sorry, you can't have that. There is no alternative fact. There's just a fact. And we have, as part of our society polarization, divisiveness, lost that anchor in some places because we've ended up in these tribal arrangements, and everybody in your tribe are the people you trust, and if somebody in the tribe says something that actually isn't true, you might feel like you have to go along anyway. And we've all allowed ourselves, particularly with the barrage of information from social media and cable news and politicians, to have things brought on board for our category of established facts that probably aren't. So some house cleaning is also going to be needed here if we're going to get ourselves past this difficult place. So truth is crucial. Science is a way of discovering truth about the natural world, and science makes mistakes. Let's be clear about that. But science is self-correcting. Anything that science comes up with that's wrong, somebody is going to test that in another experiment and realize, that didn't going to work, and it will ultimately get straightened out. So if somebody's making a scientific claim and you see the source is someone with expertise and it's been validated by other groups doing similar experiments, then it's probably true. The COVID vaccines were safe and effective. They got less effective as the virus evolved into new versions, almost like we had a new virus every 6 months, and the vaccine was not as effective, which is why we needed boosters and all that. But the science behind this was absolutely solid. And then there's a whole issue about how faith fits into this, and for this particular gathering on a Sunday morning, we should think about that. Aren't we people of truth? Didn't Jesus say, I am the way, the truth, and the life? Didn't Jesus say the truth will set you free? Those are all things that we were told. And yet somehow, particularly in this time where there's so much misinformation flying around, people of faith have often been particularly vulnerable to being captured by those kinds of arguments, especially if they seem to tap into something that was part of their tribe. We as people of faith really need to rise to the occasion in front of us now of how do we bring ourselves and our country and our world back to a place where we do trust the truth and we are not ashamed to stand up for it. You know, the group that is least likely to accept climate change as being real, evangelical Christians. We have a serious threat to our planet. And the first step, of course, is to accept that it is a threat and to accept the fact that it's primarily on the basis of human action. That's not a hard case to make if you look at the evidence. It's overwhelming. And yet, the church seems to have been particularly slow to come along with this sense that we are responsible, or we should be, stewards of God's wonderful creation, and we should be out in front here figuring out ways to care for creation. Biologos has stepped into that space as well. A lot of this kind of comes down to trust. And this is maybe the point I want to make, and then I want to hear if you all have some questions. It seems we have, in many ways, lost some of our instincts about who to trust And why? And again, that partly because of this separation into these separate tribes. We tend to trust the people in our tribe, even though they may not be qualified. And we tend to distrust people in that other group over there, even though that may be somebody with absolutely stellar credentials, because everything is colored over. And I'm sorry, it's politics that has primarily created those tribal differences. Trust really ought to depend on three things. Does this source have integrity? Have they been honest? Are they being honest now? Do they have competence? Do they know their stuff? Is this somebody who's actually done the work to become an expert in an area, or just tossed off an idea in social media? And third, maybe don't think about this one so obviously, but I think it's right in there, is does this source have humility? Are they willing to admit they don't know everything? They can say, here's what I know because of my expertise in this space, but if you ask me about something over there, you better talk to somebody else because I don't have any special knowledge there. That's what you want to find. And there are sources like that out there, but oftentimes their recommendations are being ignored by people who are not in their bubble just because everything else is eclipsed by our divided society. We need to figure out how to get past that. So what can we do? We heard this morning, thank you, Vicar Asher, for a wonderful sermon about Pope Francis describing the church as a field hospital. Well, boy, we sure are right now. Our world, our country, our communities are all hurting with this. Watching to see what's happening to medical research right now is utterly heartbreaking. An unprecedented attack that has gone on now for only a little over 3 months and has done more damage to this remarkable American enterprise that focuses on relieving suffering and finding cures for disease than anything I've seen in my entire life, and already running the risk of being potentially irreversible. About 1 out of 3 graduate students that I've talked to is seriously looking about moving to another country to pursue their scientific dreams because they aren't convinced anymore that that's going to be possible here with the way that budgets are being cut rather carelessly and heartlessly. People are being fired. All kinds of constraints are being put on scientists in terms of what they're allowed to study and what they're not. This doesn't feel like something that could have happened here, but it is. I'll have a little more to say about that tonight on 60 Minutes if you happen to turn that on. So what are we going to do about it? I don't see our politicians solving this problem because they've kind of created it, to be honest. If you look at the surveys, our political class is more polarized than we are. So they're not going to bring us back together. I don't see the media doing it either. Who's it going to be? It's got to be we, the people. It's got to be each one of us making a decision that we are potentially the solution, but it's going to take some work. And it means wrapping your arms around that. There's even a pledge in the last chapter of this book that if you have a chance to look at, I hope you would read and think about taking. And basically the pledge says, I'm going to be part of the solution by several things, but 2 in particular. Just think about this. Is this something you could do? One is, I'm going to start reaching out to the people that I've stopped talking to and see if I can start to be a bridge builder. And that means sitting down and over a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or whatever and saying, you know, we clearly disagree about a really important issue. Maybe it's how public health has been managed. Maybe it's about whether elections are fair. Maybe it's about immigration. That's a particularly hot one. I understand you have a very different view, and I want to really have you tell me the background for how you've arrived at that conclusion. I really want to understand this. So tell me about it. I'm going to ask you questions. I'm not going to hit you with my snappy response about why you're wrong. That's not why I'm here. I'm really here to try to understand. And I'm even going to talk back after you've told me. I'm going to tell you what I heard you say, and you can tell me whether that's accurate. This is something the organization called Braver Angels, which I'm part of, has been pushing forward, and I think it works really well in the right situation where you have somebody who's willing to take a chance. And we all know people like that. Some of them are family members or our friends or people we used to talk to at a soccer game. Go through that experience, and you'll be surprised. You will not necessarily change their mind, but you'll recreate a friendship. And they will tell you things that you have to kind of look at your own position and go, you know, maybe I've been a little too harsh on that one, and maybe I've taken on board some things that aren't quite true either, and maybe my behavior is not helping. Those kinds of insights. It's kind of a truth and reconciliation program done on a small scale. And then the other thing that I think we all need to do is to really tighten up our assessment of information that's coming at us and be unwilling to say, I'm going to accept something just because I like it and it resonated with my current biases. Is it true? And look at the things I've already taken on board and discard some of the ones that don't meet that standard. But going forward, really be scrupulous about that. Is that source? Do they have integrity? Are they in fact competent? Do they have humility? If those three are not there, be skeptical, which means most of social media is probably not going to be the place to grab onto truth and expect it to hold up. So I would encourage you to think about those kinds of things. I now want to hear what your questions might be, because Roy stood up, which indicates that it's probably time for that moment to happen. So I gather there might be roving microphones or something like this. Anything you'd like to bring up here about this? And after we have some Q's and A's, then I think we'll have a little hymn at the end. And then in order to make room for the next service, we'll make sure to finish on time. Questions?
Oh, hello, Dr. Francis Collins. Thank you for your presentation. Yeah, I'm most curious about, it's a two-part question. First is, in your faith journey, how did you land with Christianity as opposed to other faith traditions?
Yeah.
And then secondly, as a Christian, have you ever had scientific data that you felt conflicted or you found you had to wrestle with from the Christian perspective? And if so, did you suspend belief? Like, what was your process like when you discovered things like that?
Great questions. In my journey, and I sort of skipped over a lot of the 2-year process, I did try to understand, if I'm going to move in the direction of theism, what are the options there? And so I did look at the world's great religions enough to get a pretty good sense of what their fundamentals were. And I realized they had a lot in common, which was reassuring, special things like the moral law. But it was the person of Jesus that was so different, so hard to put together with other kinds of faith traditions, and who called out for an answer because he claimed not just to be a way to God, but to be the Son of God. And this argument that Lewis puts forward very clearly, that you can't just say this was a great moral teacher and move on, because if he also claimed to be divine, then either, as Lewis would say, he's a liar, or he's a lunatic, or he's telling the truth. And for me, I had ultimately to make that decision. The evidence was there. And it also, as I tried to explain, solved for me this problem of my sinfulness in a unique way, the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. So again, I have great respect, and I've learned a lot from other faith traditions, but the person of Jesus has been, for me, the way in which it all fell together and made sense, and also carried the ring of truth, including the literal resurrection from the dead, which I believe really happened. In terms of science and conflicts, I don't think I can come up with a place where evidence that came out of a scientific experiment rocked me, because I didn't worry about this notion about having to have a particular version of the origin story of humans true. It seemed like the Bible left a lot of flexibility there for science to fill in the uncertainties. I have had instances where science has come up with possibilities that as a Christian I'm really troubled about. A prominent one right now is the ability, using this remarkable tool called CRISPR, to actually edit the genome. If you think of it as a Word document, to go and do your word processor find and replace for our own instruction book for your future children. It is theoretically possible, and it's been done once in China, inappropriately to edit a human embryo and to actually change the very nature of the essence of that future person. And there's pretty significant resistance against that amongst secular ethicists, but it's weakening a bit of late. Most of the arguments were, well, it's not safe. Well, suppose it got safe. Would it be okay? Not for me. We are already fearfully and wonderfully made. The idea that we would take that upon ourselves to do some remaking seems to cross a line that, as a Christian, I'm not comfortable. And I've been pretty outspoken about that. Not everybody agrees with me. Those kinds of things do occasionally come up. Although I would say the field of ethics, although it doesn't realize it, has most of its foundation on the Judeo-Christian tradition. So even a secular ethicist often comes up with an argument in an ethical situation that I totally agree with because they're basing it upon the same foundation. Other questions? One over here.
Thanks for taking my question. In your view, as an expert in DNA, have you ever thought about the virgin birth and where the second part of the DNA came from? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have. Yeah, it gets kind of woolly, but basically, one would have to say that part of Jesus' DNA came from Mary, and the other part from the Holy Spirit. I don't know what would have happened if we'd been able to do chromosome analysis. Would you have seen a 46XY? I suspect you would have, because I think that's how it was all arranged. If you want to get really into interesting space, we could argue about whether sinfulness is dominant or recessive. And apparently sinlessness is dominant, given the fact that Jesus had half of his biological inheritance from Mary, who I don't think anyone would argue was free of the same issues that we all deal with of being fallen. So yeah, we could go on about that. There was this claim for a while that the DNA of God had been identified from the Shroud of Turin. And that was kind of like interesting. Let's see what that looks like. Turns out the shroud was a little too recent and it didn't quite hold up.
Hi, Dr. Collins. I was a science teacher in middle school for 29 years.
Wonderful.
And a lover of science for most of my life. And many conversations with colleagues who questioned my belief because, well, was there evidence, factual evidence to prove my faith? And I found there's never been a contradiction for me in my belief in science and my faith.
I'm with you.
But I always struggled with an answer from my colleagues. What did you say to people when they question you?
Believe me, I did get that question. I said, well, the subtitle of my book, The Language of God, is A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. I think there's evidence, but it falls short of a proof. If God had given us an absolute airtight mathematical proof, first of all, Eugene Peterson said, how do you say I love you with algebra? It might be a little hard to imagine what that would look like. But then, if it was that airtight, then we would all have become completely committed believers. There would be no opportunity for us to search and find. Our own free will, which I believe is quite real, would be irrelevant. It does seem if God is interested in us as people to have a relationship with, he wants us to have some ambiguity, to fall in love, not because we have to, but because we want to. And that sort of makes some sense to people. The other thing to turn around is to ask them, well, why do you believe in atheism? What's your proof that there is no God? That's a hard one for anybody to answer. Imagine, I've tried this trick as well, maybe it'll help you. Ask somebody who's a strict atheist, Can you draw a circle in the air that represents all of the knowledge that has ever been or ever will be about everything? And so they'll say, well, yeah, that would be like this huge circle. Okay, now, on the same scale, draw a circle about what you currently know. Even the boldest person. Suppose the knowledge of God's existence is outside your little circle. How can you, as a rational person, say, I know there is no God? That is a lot more faith than my saying, I believe in Jesus.
We have time for one more, and so over here, I'm sorry.
Dr. Collins, thank you for your time and wisdom today. You kind of touched on it with CRISPR, but I had a broader question about exotic experiments that we are at the capacity of doing in science today, be it Neuralink or...
Hold your mic a little closer.
The more exotic experiments like Neuralink, geoengineering, Large Hadron Collider, smashing particles at really high speeds. These are big experiments that have big impacts at a larger scale than we've ever seen with science, or could very quickly. Ethically, spiritually, how do you face that skepticism or just the scale of that for people?
Great question. You know, people asked that same question about the Human Genome Project when we were starting it. Is this really something we should be doing? Is this going to change our total view of humanity? Are we going to become much more focused on ourselves just as a script as opposed to a person of spirit? Some of the things you mentioned, I do think, have profound consequences for us as Christians. The whole idea of connecting computers to your brain, the Neuralink that you mentioned. While we've seen some dramatic things happen for benefit of people with paralysis or strokes, enabling them to be able to have more function, and I'm strongly in support of that. If you can get somebody who was paralyzed below the neck to be able to operate a robot just by thinking about it, or somebody who can't speak to be able to imagine the words they want to say and then have them appear on a computer screen for somebody to read, that feels like the kind of healing that God calls us to. But when it gets to the point of saying, well, we're imperfect and we need to be enhanced, we need to be in some way improved by engineering, biotechnology, same thing as I was talking about with editing the human embryo, I think we should be very concerned as Christians about those things. And there's a lot of that now is potential, and the whole advent of artificial intelligence and all the applications that are being proposed, some of which are real and a lot of which are not, deserves close attention to people of faith. And BioLogos has now also stepped into that space to initiate some of those conversations that haven't really been happening at the level that they should. So you're quite right. This is an area we should all be tracking.
And now the moment we've been waiting for.
Wow.
And just in case people didn't hear that as he's tuning up here and so on, BioLogos Foundation.
Yes, BioLogos, BIOLOGOS.org, if you want to hear more about this.
BioLogos.org.
And I'm not sure my lavalier is on. You see your belt there? Yeah. You got it on back there? Check, check. Okay, I think we're coming across. So just to finish off this lovely morning, I really appreciate the chance to have had this opportunity to come to your church and have this conversation. I always like to finish with a little singing because that brings us together. This is a hymn where the words are really stunning, and they're written by Reverend Thomas Troger, who's now passed on, a wonderful pastor in Colorado who had such a knack with lyrics. But it's a hymn about how science and faith are both given to us by God. The source of faith and learning, yes, that's God. The tune, if you've ever sung Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, that's it. It's what you call Hifridal. So maybe it'll be familiar, but I'll see if I can help with a little bit of the accompaniment. And here are the words. Praise the source of faith and learning that has sparked and stoked the mind with a passion for discerning how the world has been designed. Let the sense of wonder flowing from the wonders we survey keep our faith forever growing and renew our need to pray. God of wisdom, we acknowledge that our science and our art and the breadth of human knowledge only partial truth impart. Far beyond our calculation lies a depth we cannot sound, where your purpose for creation and the pulse of life are found. Key change. Yeah, stand up. As to currents in a river, fight each other's undertow, till converging they deliver one coherent steady flow. Blend, O God, our faith and learning till they carve a single course, till they join as one, returning praise and thanks to you, their source. Amen. Roy, this is sweet to be able to be here.
Thank you so much to Dr. Francis Collins. And
Blessings.
there's another worship service that's going to start at some point in time.
Blessings, everyone.
biologos.org.
Thanks, my friend.